Hey, welcome back, CHOMPI friends. I'm so glad you're here today, because we get to talk all about the new tempo firmware for CHOMPI. I think for me, in many ways, this new firmware feels like it unlocks a brand new instrument within this same CHOMPI hardware. And I guess what I mean by that is that when I approach making music with tempo, the outcome is just wildly different than with tape. And, that's by design, because they are each other's counterpart in many ways. But since they do have a lot of familiar controls, my hope is that a lot of you will take to this new firmware pretty quickly, because it still feels, at least to me, very chompy. So with that in mind, this video is really a top-down overview of some of the basic controls, and then we're going to discuss some of the new engines. Maybe at the end, we'll also do like a start from scratch type of jam that can bring everything together in like a musical context. Okay, so why don't we kick things off by talking about this set of controls right here? Because I feel like they're going to be the most familiar to everybody. That's like our sampling and sound design engines. We've made a couple new additions, some little tweaks here or there that I'll point out, but for the most part, they are relatively the same as they have been with tape. So the mode switch is still going to determine what our CHOMPI key does. When we flip it up, the CHOMPI key becomes our sample record key. And when I flip it down, it's our shift or function key, which opens up secondary functions across the whole device. Then for encoder number 1, a lot of the stuff is going to feel the same. So this is our speed, our sample speed and direction. And then the shift control here is the same. So if I hold shift, this is going to be our coarse control or our quantized control of fifths and octaves for our sample. We can get into reverse territory a little faster this way. And then while holding shift, if I press the encoder, it will reset the value to its default position. And that's actually true across all of the pages of these 4 encoders now. So it's going to reset the primary and secondary function, whatever page that you're on. Moving on, this is also pretty much the same. So this is our sample volume, and then the sample pan. Same kind of deal. If I shift press, then it'll reset. And then there's a new third page on this encoder now. So if I press this one, you notice a little purple LED. And this is now 2 different sample-specific effects. The first one is a multi-mode kind of resonant DJ style filter. Not all that different from the filter that used to be in the effects section with tape. There's just built-in resonance this time around. And that's because underneath that is a sample rate reduction. So if I hold shift, I can engage that. And this is happening pre-filter, so that I can crunch it up and then I can filter out the frequencies that I may not want. And then what's cool, because it's in the sound design engine, all of those knobs and positions are going to get saved per preset, per sample. So if I have something dialed in, with a filter that I really like, now when I save that preset, I can keep those settings the way that I'd like. And that's really useful later, I think, especially when we're dealing with things that are more synthesizer heavy, because you always want to filter typically for that type of sound. If I click this encoder, then I jump back to where we started. Now for encoders 2 and 3 here, I feel like it's best to talk about them as a pair because they interact with one another quite a bit. So it might make sense to talk about them at the same time. This is our sample start point and our sample end point. Basically, the 2 of them set the overall window length of our recording. So we're listening to the default sample here for the boot up. Now if I, kind of boring example, but if I move the endpoint, you'll notice that my window gets smaller. Then if I hold shift and I press the encoder, it'll reset. A quicker way to do that is the new shift function, which is like a coarse control, and that actually will evenly divide the window in half. So every interval it's going to divide smaller and smaller. Now one thing I kind of want to point out here is that we can now, with the tempo firmware, make our sample window so small that it can actually become an oscillator for something like making like a wavetable synth voice. So why don't we actually try that really quick? Now that's where that filter might come in handy. If I want to filter out some of that, and then maybe I even want to crunch it up a little bit. Now for that example, we were starting with something that was already musical by nature. But we could do the same thing with something that's super not musical. Like, why don't we just take a second and I'll make a new sample like a snap. Okay, there's a snap. Now, I can do the same thing. That's pretty cool. Yeah, so you get the idea. But it's definitely quite fun if you want to start making synth voices, essentially wavetables, out of any sample that you have lying around. It's definitely where I've lost many hours lately. So anyway, that's the top pages of encoders 2 and 3. And then really quick, let's just touch on page 2 here, which is our attack and release settings for our envelope. Probably to show that the most easiest is let's just select preset number 2 here. It's our organ sound. There's our attack. And then let's add some release in there. And that's that. So there's one key difference that I just want to really quickly point out. There's these two sample toggle options here in our sample engine. And the first is whether or not your sample is going to loop or not once it reaches the endpoint. And the other is the key hold or sustain toggle. For the sake of time, I don't think we need to get into those too deep, but I just want to show you how you access them. So the shift control now, if you shift and turn the encoder, it will toggle those options on or off. So on means the sample is going to loop, and then off means once it reaches the endpoint, it'll just play out and then be done. And then this one is whether or not the sustain part or the key hold part of your envelope is going to be there. If you turn it off, what you'll notice, like I'll set my settings a little tighter, is it's just going to play through the envelope settings and then be done, no matter how long I hold the key down. And I think the reason that this is kind of important to point out is that when we start talking about sequencing things, that can be really helpful to know that it's there so that you know how to make your notes a little shorter or a little more percussive. So now that we've covered some of those more familiar controls from the sound design engine, I'm going to quickly skip over the effects so that we can talk about what I think is my favorite part of tempo, the pattern generator, which is essentially like a quirky arpeggiator meets a simplified step sequencer. It's like a quick and intuitive way to build pattern-based or clock-based music with your samples. So why don't we take a stab at making a pattern together here? The first thing you need to know is to run or activate the pattern generator. You just press the play key. And then what you're going to notice is that all the notes that I hold down are going to be played on a rhythmic grid. And that grid is set by the clock or the tempo of this knob here. So you can see I can make it a little faster, can make it slower, but ultimately all of my notes are always going to be rhythmically in line with whatever my tempo is set to. Now, you also notice that if I let go, my notes don't stick around, right? So they're all updating in real time. But if I'd like to latch those notes, all I have to do is press the loop key. And now you notice a little red LED shows up underneath the keys. And at this point, A, I don't have to hold down notes anymore, but B, I can actually edit my sequence. So if I want to, I can add new notes, or I can even take away old notes. So it's kind of nice that you get real-time feedback. You're hearing what you're doing in real time. And the length of your pattern is based on how many notes you have. We can also change the preset while the pattern is running. And you can edit and pretty much do everything else just like you would if you were playing on the keyboard. Now, if I don't want my sequence to keep running, I could, of course, press the pause key, or I could just press the loop key again and it will clear all of my active notes. So it just goes right back to being an ARP again. There's also another way, if you want to kind of approach it at a different angle to build a sequence and build a pattern. If we press the loop key first, now what it's going to do is latch and remember the notes I've pressed. And now when I hit play, this is where it starts to feel a little bit like a simple step sequencer. But now once it's here, it's pretty much the same. So from there, you can take it in a lot of different directions. Why don't we just look at some of the shift functions here so that you can add a little bit more variety to your pattern. Now you notice it's going to follow the note order in which I pressed everything down. And that's because the ARP style is set to the note order. And that is dictated by this key here. So if it's light blue, that's what it means. If I press it though, now it's going to be up. And if I press it again, it's going to go down. And then this one is ping pong, up and down. And then the last one is fully random. So the note order is just going to constantly change and evolve. If I press it again, it goes back to my original note order. Similarly, but kind of different, the loop key also has 5 different what I call rest patterns. And these patterns will add in a rest at different times. Now it doesn't skip the note that would take place on that step. It nudges the note 1 over. And this can help create different types of variety to your rhythms. So I press it again, we're going to add 2 rests. And then this one is 2 rests but in different spots. And then kind of a similar thing. Yeah. And then we go back and now we have no rests. So the 2 of these combined can actually be pretty powerful. And it goes a little bit further. Let's go back to our default settings here so that you can clearly hear. The shift turn function here of the transport knob is a random probability. And what this does is that on every activated step, the probability can be an octave up or an octave down of that note, as well as a slight adjustment to the note order. So it's going to create more variation in our pattern. Lastly, I'm going to show 2 little hidden functions here. And the first is, if you press down and turn, you can get multiplications or divisions of the master clock setting. So if you want to quickly jump around, that's a good way to do it. And then also, if we tap 2 or more times, we can have a tap tempo. So if you're playing along with other stuff, sometimes that's handy to have a tap tempo. But yeah, I think that kind of covers it for the basics of the pattern generator. And now I think we can start talking about some of the other stuff. For instance, now feels like a pretty good time to circle back to the effects section. What you're hearing is part of Tempo's new clock synced delay system. So yeah, let's talk about it. So to get things going, let's use this bass line here, and then I'll start to bring in the effects and then we can talk about what's happening. So the whole effects engine here in Tempo is completely redesigned, and we tried to create something that would complement the pattern-based workflow. So we came up with this kind of, I guess at its basic form, it's like a fancy clocked synced delay. But there's two different flavors to it. There's one on the left and there's one on the right, with the noon position being off. So right now, we don't hear any effects. But if I start to move to the left side here, you notice we get a looping delay in the background. Now that delay is always looking to the master BPM to know how to set how long it needs to be. If I move the knob a little further, you notice the LED jumps and our window jumps. These are all different mathematical intervals of our clock. And the further I go to the left, the intervals get a little smaller until we get to the smallest interval. So that's kind of the most basic form of what the delay sounds like. If I go all the way back to noon, then you're not going to hear it. The right side has a mirrored version of the same delay, but this time it's getting passed through a diffusion reverb. And the diffusion starts to take over more and more by the time we get all the way to the far clockwise part of the knob. We can dial it back. Now let's talk about the shift function of the delay here real quick. I'm going to go back to the largest interval on the dry side. And then I'm going to dial up my shift control. And what you start to hear is a similar kind of random probability that we can use on our transport knob, but this time it's applied directly to the delay line. So the chances of probability will be an octave up, an octave down, or a reverse of the delay. Now, it can be applied differently, kind of sound a little different depending on what kind of intervals we use. On the right side, it's similar, but it's a little bit different on how the random events take place. We only have octave up this time, and then we have random panning. And this is to kind of create almost like a pseudo-granular style effect. But you notice it's always somewhat clocked synced with what's happening. Now there's one more kind of special trick here. Let's go back to the left side because I feel like it's easier to hear. If I press the encoder, instead of switching to another page, what's going to happen is it's going to freeze my delay buffer, and then it's going to keep that same piece of audio inside, and it's going to loop it. Now, I can move through the intervals still. Go to the right side and use that same buffer. And then if I press it, it will unfreeze. Now you're probably wondering, but is there another page? And there is. We access it through a long press now. So if I long press, now I'm entering into the second page, which is kind of like a set of hidden controls for the delay. And this first one is a effects send amount. So this controls, and this is actually per engine. We're going to talk about the slice engine in a second, but you can control how much per engine that you're sending to the effect. And then underneath that, the shift control is our delay feedback, or our repeat amount. What's kind of unique about this shift control though, is that once you reach past about 50 or 60% of the feedback amount, what's going to start to happen is that the new material is going to sidechain or duck the delay line. So if I increase it a little bit more, we can almost go to the point where we don't even hear the delay anymore. But watch what happens if I bring it back. So it's being fed new material, we're not hearing it because it's ducking it out of the way. Now, that's an extreme case, but we can dial that in to taste. When I click the encoder, I go back to the top page again. I think that's probably as far as I'll go on the effects section for now, because I really want to bring the slice engine into the mix. I think once we get that in there, things are really going to start to come alive. So why don't we, I guess, just dive straight into the slice engine now. Welcome to my other favorite part of Tempo, Slice Mode. Slice Mode is the new sample engine that runs in parallel to the chromatic engine. And essentially, it replaced the one-shot or the cubby mode engine that we had before. And what makes it different is that instead of there being an individual one-shot sample on each of the keys, instead you have one audio file that gets automatically divided or sliced up into 16 different slices. And those get played on the white keys here. So even though they kind of sound like, in this case, different drum samples, which they are, they're actually just a part of one audio file that I placed a bunch of drum samples in my DAW on 16 different grid spots that are all evenly aligned. And then I exported it all as one file, and now I can play them as individual hits. Now, in this case, like there's different drum kits, but they don't have to be drum kits. We can do melodic content. We can do drum breaks. There's a lot of different possibilities. Probably the most obvious way to showcase what's happening actually inside the slice engine is to just record a sample directly into CHOMPI here. It may not be the most musical example, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now if I... You notice I can have each slice be a different part of that sample. If I want to sequence that, then I can run my pattern generator. Now, if I move my start and end point of my sample window, I'm actually going to be moving these outer parts of the whole group of slices. So everything is going to still be mathematical, but the outcome will be different audio on those slices. Yeah, so again, not a super musical example, but yeah, it gives you an idea of what's actually taking place here inside the slice engine. And then remember, both of our sampling engines are actually running in parallel to one another, meaning that they can play at the exact same time and they can be sequenced totally independently of one another. So if we wanted to, let's say, build a drum pattern here, and then use that same sample that I just made with my voice. Maybe we can turn this into a synth real fast. Anyway, you probably get the idea by now. To wrap things up, there's a couple more performance features that I want to point out, and I think the best way to do that is to do like a start from scratch kind of jam. So why don't we go ahead and we'll wipe the slate clean here, and that way, when I boot back up, everything will be back into its default positions. And since I'm using the exact same factory card profile from what's available on the site to download, hopefully what you're seeing and what I'm seeing will actually be pretty much identical. Before we get into building our pattern and doing a little bit of jamming here, this might be a good opportunity to talk about the new preset behavior with Tempo, because it operates a little bit differently than with tape. For example, why don't I select preset number 8 here and make some changes to it. Why don't we pitch it up and then maybe increase the release time. Those changes that I just made, if I were to power cycle again right now, will not be there when I revisit that preset, unless I choose to manually override or copy that preset onto itself. And I can do that with our preset management keys here, which are all the same, your erase, copy, and save keys. So if I copy preset number 8 onto itself, hit the CHOMPI key to confirm, then those preset changes will be on that slot when I power cycle or when I reselect the preset. Now, I wanted this behavior because if I'm building a pattern here and I tweak my preset that I've selected, like I could even go further. Why don't we add some sample rate reduction and then maybe filter that out. And then maybe for funsies, we'll add in some effects. It's really handy to be able to quickly snap back the preset to the way it was last saved, because it keeps things interesting. I find I use it all the time when I'm performing because I can always know that, oh, I might explore a little bit here or do things I wouldn't normally do if I felt precious about the way my preset was. Because I know it's kind of like a checkpoint I can come back to, and I can bring things back to like home base. On a somewhat related note, there's another performance feature that I want to point out here, and we call them snapshots. And essentially snapshots are like an auto-save temporary spot for every parameter and everything that you have currently active on your CHOMPI to be recalled and or passed back and forth between the two snapshots. This is A and this is B. So when you boot up, you're automatically going to boot up into A, meaning everything you're going to do is naturally being saved into A. But B will be blank unless we choose to copy A or pass A over to B. So why don't we actually just show that in action here. I'm going to press and hold A, and you notice a little green LED blinks. And now when I switch to B, instead of it being blank, it's going to be just an identical copy of everything I just had in A. But now when I make tweaks or edits to it, those are only getting applied to B. So we can jump or pass back and forth between them at any point. And this is just another way to keep everything moving. You never really run into dead ends here on tempo. We can make all sorts of tweaks. Yeah, so I use snapshots for all sorts of stuff. You can kind of use them almost like two decks that a DJ would have, like where you have two different pieces of something that you want to jump between. You can use one as like a pseudo undo, like if you have something you like and you don't know if you want to make tweaks to it and you're not sure about those, you can always just copy it to B, make the tweaks there, but then you always know that A is there if you want to jump back to it. So now I think we have all the ingredients that we need to do a little bit of jamming here. I'm going to clear my pattern here and hop over to slice mode so that we can build maybe a little drum beat. Why don't we choose preset number 8, which I think is it's an 808. All right, starting from a clean slate, let's go ahead and build a drum pattern. I'm going to use something we actually didn't talk about earlier, and it has to do with these black keys up here. So you'll notice when I press them, unlike the white keys, there's no audio that comes out. But when I'm sequencing, I can use these as rest steps, which gives me the ability to have a little bit more variation on my rhythms. So why don't we just punch in a beat here? I'm going to do a kick, a couple rests, a snare, maybe another rest, and then some hi-hats. Yeah, I like that. Why don't we add a little delay in here? And let's add some random probability to the delay, which can kind of act like a drum fill. Yeah, I like that. One other thing we didn't talk about earlier that I should probably point out here has to do with this special slice key over here on the end. Some of you, when I said there's 16 slices, you probably did the math and were like, yeah, but there's only 15 white keys here, Tobias, so how does that work? Well, this special slice key I call the combo slice. And basically, slices 15 and 16 both live on this key. If you're just playing the key, it will alternate between the two different slices. But when you're sequencing it, you can actually sequence the first one is 15, the second press is 16, and then the third press is 15 and then 16. So this gives you the ability to have 16 actual steps. Like if you had a perfect loop in here and you wanted there to be an even 16 steps, you can do that here with this extra combo slice mode. But instead of these hi-hats, I could actually just replace this. These two hits will now be here as toms on the end. Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. All right, so here's my drum pattern. I'm gonna work with this and move over to the chromatic engine. And since we were using preset number 8 earlier, we could stick to that. Maybe we'll go 2 octaves down, like a bass. Real quick, what happens if we don't want the keyboard to be arpeggiated, but we still want our beat to run in the background? So we can actually uncouple our keys from the arpeggiator by long pressing the play key while the other engine is playing in the background. And this gives us the ability to then why don't we have one of our snapshots be uncoupled from the keyboard, and then the other one can be a latched sequence. So since we're in A, I'm going to keep that one as my sequence here. So I'll hit play again, and then let's make a nice, simple... Yeah. Keep it kind of low. All right, now if I copy A, pass it over to B, and I switch to B, now I can just long press and uncouple. And now I can jump back and forth, and I can kind of do like a solo mode here. So let's go back to A. What if I even want to change the preset here? So as you might be able to tell, there's a lot of fun to be had here with tempo. And I can't wait to see what you guys do with it. And if you're still hanging out here at the end of what I'm sure is going to be an incredibly long video, I want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for all of your support and interest in CHOMPI over the years. I just can't tell you how much it means to me to see where this little box has gone and what everyone has created with it. So I guess I'll sign off by saying, happy chomping, everybody.